Well, I think we can start now. Well, good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to the second day of the webinar, Securing a Decent Income for Farmers, Metrics and Strategies for Achieving Living Income in Cash-Crop Supply Chains. My name is Carlos Esteban Cabrera, and I work as an economist at the Agri-Food Economics and Policy Division, ESA, here at FAO. And today I will be facilitating this webinar. Just a few remarks, probably those that were here yesterday already listened, but for those new, I have to say, together with Ana Paula de la O, we coordinate the Technical Network on Poverty Analysis, TPA, and for those that are new and that probably are listening or joining one of our webinars for the first time, we are a network in FAO who organize webinars and other capacity development events related to measurement and analysis in rural poverty. And lately, we've been the project has been evolving, and we have extended the topics to other rural development issues. And this year, specifically, we started organizing uh, not only technical webinars, but now the next one that we will be organizing is actually a policy webinar. So we will keep you updated. We have two channels of communication. For those colleagues that are from FAO, we just created a team, a TPA team, where we are sending regularly the news about the events that we are organizing. So if you would like to, or if you haven't been added yet and you would like to join, you can reach out either to Ana Paula, to me, or to our email that is teampa@fao.org. And if you are not an FAO colleague but also still interested in knowing what are the events that we organize, you can go to our webpage. I think probably we will send it through the chat later on, so you can visit and you can keep updated on the events that we organize. So probably, I was thinking that it was good to start with a short recap of what we saw yesterday, so you can be better informed of what we are gonna be listening today. So yesterday we had the presentation of Katia Covarrubias, who is a colleague here from FAO. She presented on living income measurement methods, a working paper that she and other co-authors developed. And she basically compared on detail the two best documented methodologies to calculate living income benchmark. Uh, just to a recap, the living income benchmark refer to the cost of attaining a decent standard of living in a specific place for a reference family. And then, she did a very well job, very detailed. And then she also analyzed and proposed a new metric for the computation of the living income gap. What is the living income gap? And it refers to the difference between the actual net household income and from all the sources, not only from the crop production and the living income benchmark, right? So a few takeaways that we had from yesterday, it was that when computing living income benchmarks, the reporting unit, or precisely the level at which the living income benchmark was being reported matters on how it can be used by others. So, for instance, while using a reference household or a family to calculate was useful, one of the suggestions was that it can be more it can improve the operationalization of the concept to report it in unitary terms, and that would also allow for better comparability across existing welfare metrics such as the poverty, so we can see more clearly how living income benchmarks differentiate from common poverty measures. The other key takeaway point was that the evaluation of the model diet, which was found to be sensitive to key parameters such as the selection of equivalence scales and also the price assumptions that were made due to and also the seasonality of prices. No, so she called out to the data collection process regarding to prices. This is a core aspect that should be carefully consider when collecting this data to compute living income benchmarks. And last, well, she also called to enhance the information that was used to the computation of the non-food and non-housing components of the living income benchmark, right? So that were the few key takeaways, but also the presentation was enriched by the discussion of three discussants, or actually four, sorry, who provided very thoughtful feedback on the work that was done. And well, we'll not enter in detail, but I would just say that all the points were like duly noted and will be implemented like in future work that they will be like pursuing, right? So, but what about today? So one I have like done this recap. Basically, let's just like remember once again what is living income, no? So if as it is defined as the net actual income required for a household in a particular place to afford a decent standard of living for all the members of the household, then if we think about these households that depend on agricultural production, so then they must be able to generate, enough revenue, because normally in this value chain that we are talking is basically our crops like coffee or cacao that cannot be actually consumed like to higher degree by them. So they need to sell it. So, like basically, so if one would like to think like about like a simple equation, then what it would be revenue would be basically the computation of prices times the yield or the quantity that's being produced minus the cost that like they infer like in producing, and that should be at least this living income benchmark that we saw how it was computed yesterday, right? So precisely how to set up this price is what we are gonna be looking today in the in the presentation that we're gonna see today. And this, just to finalize my interview, like these preliminary remarks, it's good to know that it's just one of the strategies that can be used to at least like try to close this gap between the actual incomes and the living income benchmark that small scale food, not food producers, but crop producers face, right? So having said that, we are very happy to have here today with us to Carla Belheitzen, who is going to be presenting about living income reference pricing, and she's a senior advisor on sustainable livelihoods at Fair Trade International, where she leads the organizations of global income strategy. She has over 18 years of field experience, primarily in Latin America, working to strengthen farmer organizations and promote sustainable livelihoods. Over the past 8 years, she has focused on designing and implementing living income reference pricing models, overseeing its rollout across key commodities such as cocoa, coffee, and banana. And also her work spans multi-stakeholder engagement, policy advocacy, impact research, and training development to support income improvement for smallholder farmers worldwide. And after her presentation, we are also joined by Davide Del Prete, who is a colleague here at FAO. He's an economist in Agri-Food Economics and Policy Division at FAO. He works at the MAFA program on policy monitoring and impact evaluation to support sustainable agri-food system transformation. Davide holds a PhD in economics from the University of Rome Sapienza here in Italy, and he has over 9 years of experience in international development. Previous to FAO, he also has worked and collaborated with UNCTAD, the International Trade Center, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. And his research on trade and development economics has been published in leading journals. And just like to talk a bit more of the role that he's doing now in MAFAP, he coordinates the activities in Rwanda. And together with David, we are also very happy to have actually here live Christina Archer, who is a strategic advisor for livelihoods at the Sustainable Food Lab. She has nearly 35 years of experience working with smallholder farmers across all over the world. Her career spans roles with Save the Children in the UK, the private sector, and UNDP's food system team. And for the past 7 years, she has worked closely with corporate partners on living income strategies and serves as lead facilitator for the International Coffee Organization technical work stream on living income. She's also a core member of LICOP, Living Income Community of Practice, contributing to learning in events and through leadership on gender, procurement practice, and equitable livelihoods. So just to show you quickly the agenda of today, as I mentioned, the first presentation is going to be the one on reference prices by Carla. This will last like around 30 minutes. And then we will have the discussion by Davide, who also has like around 15 minutes. And then Cristina will close, but she will be rather like broadening the discussion, which going beyond reference price setting, but what are the strategies out there that exist to close the living income gap? Like not necessarily market strategies, but also other type of strategies. So I think we will learn a lot, and we will finalize with like a Q&A section. So just before giving the floor to Carla, I wanted to remind the attendees that you can submit your questions through the Q&A at any time, and we will be reading them by the end of the section in the Q&A, as I said. And also, if you would like to pose your question live, you can also do so, and you can actually even mention in the Q&A or just raise your hand, and we will give you the floor. So yeah, don't be shy. Like we are here all to learn, and so there is no right or wrong questions. And I think we are very lucky to have like world experts on the topics that we will be presenting today. So I think it's a good opportunity to ask questions. So having said that, I will give the floor to Carla. Carla, you have 30 minutes, and yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Esteban, for the introduction and for inviting me for this conversation. It's really nice to be here. And yeah, my name is already introduced, is Carla. I'm working with Fair Trade International nearly for 20 years now. And for the past 9 or so years, I've been working on strategic advice around sustainable livelihoods, and living income is a key strategic goal for us. So this is really my theme. So I'm very pleased to tell you about it. And I'm going to share my screen now. Can you just confirm that you're seeing my screen in presentation mode?
Yes.
Cool. And I'm going to talk you through a price model that we developed as key part of our living income strategy, which is called the living income reference price. And yeah, so how does that relate to the living income benchmark that you all discussed and analyzed yesterday? So what's we have discovered as well as at Fairtrade is that between the living income benchmark and the current incomes for a majority smallholder farmers, there's a significant gap. And so in a very simplified way, we're looking at what is needed to close that income gap. And we see that for a large extent, this can be closed by optimizing farm yields and efficiencies on the farm, but that is never enough to fully close the income gap. So what is also necessary is a price component. So what is a sustainable price to fully close the income gap? That's what is at the basis of the reference price model. And just to make sure that it's clear that that is not the only lever to close the income gap. We have it built into a more holistic strategy. On the one hand, responsible procurement is a key pillar of that strategy, but it cannot stand alone without also having a sustainable production pillar on the other side. And the enabling environment then is also really important to create a level playing field, to create the conditions for the other two pillars to be realized. So I'm not going to into the details of those different components. So I want to focus on the responsible procurement pillar, in which we're talking about long-term sourcing relationships between partners, risk sharing across the supply chain, but very importantly, also the right price level. Yeah, so what is a living income reference price? Just for, to avoid confusion and misunderstandings, let's be clear that when we're talking about a living income reference price, or LIRP, this is a price benchmark per unit of a product below which a farmer is not able to make a living income, and should therefore be guaranteed as a floor price in the long term by the industry. Why is this important? Because currently, as we all know, market prices are exceptionally high for coffee and cocoa crops that we work with. So we might think that a living income reference price is not that relevant, but it is, because we know the market prices fluctuate, and we need a stable basis, a stable floor price that farmers can count on if the market prices come down again. So what is the LIRP? Tell us. It is a farm gate price that farmers should minimally receive so that they can invest in their crops, to adopt sustainable agricultural practices, and afford a decent standard of living. It is not a market-driven tool. It doesn't fluctuate. So when prices are above, market prices are above the LIRP, then the market price prevails, but it provides a safety net for when market prices come down again. What's also really important to understand is that receiving a LIRP is not a guarantee that you as a farmer effectively earn a living income, because price is one of the factors that make up the income of a farmer. You have to see it in the context of all the different variables and factors that are in place. So in order to, so what we are defining when we're calculating a LIRP is when you as a farmer depend exclusively on the income from a certain crop, and you dedicate full time on this crop, this is the price that you get this price, this is what you need to earn a living income. You also that is also based on reaching a certain sustainable yield level. So I'm going to unpack that into the equation that we use for the living income price model, but not before explaining what the underlying principles of the model are. First of all, the human right to decent remuneration, which says that everyone who works has the right to a just and favorable remuneration, ensuring an existence worthy of human dignity for themselves and their families. And the other principle is that by achieving living incomes is a shared responsibility by all supply chain actors. So we're looking primarily at the farmer's role and the buyer's role in this supply chain. What does this mean for the price model? It means that we're taking into consideration that when you're a full-time farmer, you have the right to earn a living income from what your farm produces. And similarly, if you are a worker on a smallholder farm, you have the right to earn a living wage. Both, or in other words, you can say anyone who works on a farm has the right to earn a living wage for the work that is performed. If you're a full-time worker, either on your own farm or on somebody else's farm, you should be remunerated by a living wage. Then the shared responsibility comes down to having shared responsibilities for a farmer responsibility to adopt the sustainable agricultural practices in order to achieve a realistic target yield. And for the buyer, the responsibility is to pay the price that enables farmers to invest in their farms and achieve a living income. And then this translates in the following formula. So we're looking at a price level at farm gate, so what the farmer effectively receives in cash. That is equal to the cost of decent living plus the cost of sustainable production divided by the volume of production that a farmer has, and the production is then made up of two factors: the yield level and the area of the farm. So here we're going into the details. When we're looking at the cost of decent living, and we're looking at the living income benchmark, basically, that you've looked at, that you have discussed yesterday. We are adopting that benchmark, the anchor benchmark, wherever available. But what we do look into is, as a farmer, many farmers do produce part of their of the food of the family on their own farm. That is considered as an in-kind income, and that can be deducted from the cost of decent living, because it's a saving that the farmer has and doesn't need to spend on the market. So we're looking at the actual cost of decent living minus the value of farm-grown food for household consumption. And as you've seen yesterday, that in the living income benchmark, a large part, approximately half, in many countries, is made up of the cost of food. So this value of farm-grown food can be significant. Then, the cost of the sustainable yield is what we consider as a realistically attainable target yield that can be achieved when good agricultural practices are adopted. So there's the responsibility part of the farmer, that it is expected from the farmer that they also do their part in adopting agricultural practices. When we then look at cost of sustainable production, this is what investments are needed to reach the target yield. So not necessarily what farmers are actually spending in as a production cost, but rather what they need to spend in order to reach that sustainable production level, and also to pay any hired labor that is necessary at the living wage. And then finally, the crop area is the area needed to fully absorb the available household labor to be a full-time farmer, depending entirely on the income from that target crop. I'm going to go into each of those variables. The first, already explained, the living income benchmark. As you've seen yesterday, cost of nutritious diet plus housing plus other essential expenses. A small provision is the living income for a household. How does that relate then to a living wage? And how does it relate to a living income per day worked on a farm? So we divide the living income by the number of full-time equivalent income earners in the household. And we take as a rule of thumb 220 labor days per year to look at how many actual labor days are there to calculate or estimate what a farmer would need to earn on a daily basis for a day of work. And then it doesn't matter whether it is a hired worker or a family member who works on the farm, because the remuneration should be the same. Then the second variable is the sustainable yield level, and that goes hand in hand with the cost of sustainable production, because if we're expecting a higher yield, that requires more investment, so cost of production tends to go up with a higher yield. How do we define that sustainable yield level? So here we need to consider the actual context of the crop that we're looking at, and the circumstances in the country where we're defining this. We normally develop or calculate a price on a country basis and sometimes on a regional basis if there are large differences within the country, but we're also aiming to have not that large of or that many different price benchmarks within a country so that there is no unfair competition possible among regions. So yeah, looking at what is sustainable production, what is a sustainable yield level, we're trying to balance what is the economic side of it and looking at what is the optimal cost-benefit ratio. And we're looking at the environmental sustainability as an important other aspect. So what about the natural resources management, the climate resilience, and then balancing those economic benefits of a high yielding farm and the medium to long-term effects on the natural resources. And then within that, there are several factors that are then influencing what could be a realistic attainable target yield for starting with what is the production system. So are we talking about conventional production or organic production? What is the crop variety that the farmers are using? Aspects of tree density, intercropping practices, and shade management, or is it maybe under the plain sun grown? And then we're looking at what is the ideal crop life cycle, what kind of rehabilitation practices are needed, what is the optimal tree age, and then factors of geographical context like altitude, like also what is available in terms of technical assistance, of inputs, improved varieties, etc. And all of this to assess to agree on a realistic target yield. And that is normally done based as a combination of statistic data that we can get hold of, and discussion with focus groups of farmers and experts who jointly discuss and evaluate what would be realistic in the given context. Then the final variable is maybe the most challenging one to discover. What is a viable crop area based on what area would a farmer need to be fully dedicated to the crop, to fully absorb the available household labor. So for that, we need to understand how much labor goes into working on the certain crop. And that is the kind of information that is usually not easily available or very well known. And here I also need to make a little step aside to understand there are different approaches also to define or to go about different income sources in that a household may have. So let's look at, and again, this is something that you have probably seen already yesterday. If we're looking at the living income for the household, it's made up of several income sources. For the living income reference price, we're looking at the income from a certain focus group. So that's the main component of the income, but we also realize that farmer households usually also have other income sources from cash from the farm, from the in-kind. We already saw that income in the form of food that is produced for the household consumption. And often there's also additional income sources that are not farm related. So how do we then look at that income share that should be provided from the target crop? There are different approaches to that. You can either define a fixed income share, so say on average 25% of the household income comes from other sources, and 75% is coming from the crop, from the focus crop. So that is what you're counting with as the living income, the net income expectation from this price exercise. Or you can look at from the perspective of labor use. So what part of the household labor is effectively employed in the focus crop versus the available household labor that is used for in other income generating activities. And that is actually what we at Fairtrade use. Again, there are two approaches to work with that, to look at the labor share. What we have defined in our model is we're looking at optimal labor deployment of the household in the focus crop in order to solely depend on that focus crop income. And I'll get back with an example on that to explain further. You can also look at what is your proportional share that is of income that is relative to the effective labor deployed. It's actually, it's the same, looking at it from a slightly different angle, but it really comes down to what the share of household labor that is used for the focus crop should be proportional to the part of the living income that is made or generated from that work. I hope this is clear, but I'll give you an example. So for this, what we need to know is how much work days per hectare or area unit is needed to implement the sustainable production model. And then what part of that work is done by household labor or can be done by household labor when it is optimally deployed. So again, it's not necessarily that the household uses all their own labor to do the work on the farm, but for the model, we are optimizing the use of the household labor to be as much dependent on that crop in the model. And then any surplus work and a specialized task in like harvest activities are then considered to be outsourced by hired labor. But when then we know the number of household work days that are needed per area unit, we divide it by the available number of household labor days per year. And then we arrive at what would be the viable crop area to fully absorb the available household labor. And then looking at what is the available household labor, in theory, we look at if we're having, for instance, a household composed of 2 adults and 3 children, then we take as a rule of thumb 65% of the working age adults, so 1.5 full-time equivalent persons times 220 labor days in the year to arrive at 330 days. So say you need 150 days per hectare for working on the farm, on the crop, then you'd need 2 hectares as a viable crop area to fully utilize the available household labor. Then to avoid, we then often get the question, but then are you promoting single crop farmers that they depend fully on such a single crop? That is not the idea. It's just used for the modeling of the price. So we're looking at 100% cash income from cocoa in this example for Ghana that we just calculated. So if for 100% dependency on cocoa, you would need 2.75 hectares of land of cocoa area, that the same model or the same price is applicable if you would only have 80% of your cash income coming from cocoa and 20% of your income coming from other crops, which would then reduce the viable cocoa area to 2.2 hectares, and so on and so forth. So it's the proportionality that is really important here. And yeah, so even if we calculate and we set a price derived from 100% dependency of a certain crop, that doesn't mean that that is effectively what would be expected from farmers, but rather just to make clear that the income share that is generated from the focus crop is dependent or relative to the use of the available household labor. And then one final aspect here with the viable productive area, we also look at when we're defining what is the sustainable production model, we need to take into consideration crop renovation. And we look then at the crop life cycle that is necessary to maintain the crop in optimal conditions. And that means that when you're renovating the farm on a continuous basis, there will always be part of the farm that is not productive because it's recently renovated. So we both consider what would be the productive area and what would be the total area, including the renovated areas that are non-productive. Then I think I'm almost there. So just as an example, what that then looks like, this is again the example for cocoa from Ghana. Here you can see all the different variables, the viable cocoa area and the productive part of that, 3.3 hectares versus 2.75. The sustainable yield level per productive area is then 600 kilos per hectare. And if you consider the entire cocoa area, that would be 500 kilos per hectare. We're looking at the different costs per hectare for inputs, for hired labor, other costs, the fixed cost for the total cost of sustainable production at 17,500 local currency. Then the income share from cocoa, as we saw earlier, it's 100% income base. So the total cash income from cocoa needs to be 52,500 Ghanaian cedis. On top of that, the farmer is expected to produce a quarter of the food needs on the farm, which is worth 7,793. And that gives us a price in local currency of 42.4 Ghanaian cedis per kilo of cocoa. So this is how we then arrive at a living income reference price. And yeah, we can do that. This is again the same numbers, but then converted to dollars. And at last, I wanted to show you that we have established developed a reference price map in which you can see all the different reference prices that we have calculated. There's a difference between the more robust analysis that we do at country level versus some more bespoke calculations that we do upon request from companies who want to know for their specific supply chain what would be a reference price for their product. And I think that was my last slide. Yes, so thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Carla. Actually, it was very efficient. You finalized even before time.
Oh,
But no, I just
really?
want to like congratulate you for the very yeah, like very informative presentation. I think yesterday and today we've been very lucky to have very good presentations by Katia and by you in these topics that could be difficult to present, but actually you have done a very good job. Um, we will we have some questions already, but I will leave them to the Q&A section,
Okay.
and I will like give the floor to the first discussant, that it's Davide. So Davide, you have the floor and you can share your screen. You have like around 15 minutes to to start to give your comments. Sorry. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Esteban, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen. All right. Do you all see my presentation? Yep. So thanks again, and let me start also by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to discuss this very timely and interesting paper. And actually, Carl, I really appreciated that you ended your presentation with examples from the coffee sector, because I also will draw primarily from the sector to discuss my main points. So here is the outline of my talk. I'll begin with a very few broad general observations. Then I will discuss also what are the potential drawbacks of implementing minimum reference prices. And then I will follow with a reflection and implications of some issues around the productivity and heterogeneity and data sources as well. And I conclude with some, few key takeaways. So when actually I think about commodity supply chains, the first thing that always comes to my mind is that they are two-sided in nature. Namely, that each actor is both at the same time a buyer and a seller. This also means that any policy targeting one specific group or actor, such as farmers in this case, inevitably has spillover effects onto others. So take, for example, a very stylized coffee supply chains here. So in this supply chain, farmers purchase inputs like fertilizers and seeds from agro dealers, then sell the coffee cherries to traders or wet mills, who in turn sell these cherries to exporters, international buyers, and eventually up to the consumers. And despite the fact that basically farmers are often, if not always, in the weakest position of with the least bargaining power among the different actors in the supply chain, any intervention that targets these farmers, this actor, must also be considered that the broader implication and impacts on the rest of the supply chain, if the goal is to improve farmer welfare sustainability. And this brings me to the first point of my discussion, which is basically related to the fact that a LERP, a living income reference price, is designed as a floor minimum price, and basically is somehow independent from market conditions. But if market prices are above the LERP, then the idea is that these prices should prevail, the market prices. So I'll give you a very specific example in which we were involved. So basically in Rwanda, since 2011, the National Agricultural Export Board, that is the part of the government of the Ministry of Agriculture Rwanda, has used a price setting table to specifically compute the coffee cherry for price at the farmer gate, with the aim to protect farmers when international prices were too low. However, this appeared to be also a kind of maximum, a ceiling price too, and therefore preventing farmers, from gaining from more favorable market conditions. And this is actually also reflected, this dynamic is reflected in the nominal rate of protection for coffee, which is basically a measure that compares that we compute in MAFA that compares the domestic farmer gate price with the international reference prices. And as you can see, between 2011 and 2022, despite this minimum price policy in place, farmers faced an average price disincentives of around 12%, suggesting that domestic prices were often lower than these reference or international benchmarks. And this suggests, to me at least, that if buyers are not actively involved in this discussion and these activities, farmers are not able or are not even allowed to benefit from better conditions in international markets. The second point is actually related to the yield assumptions that are embedded into the LIRP formula, and specifically the formula uses a sustainable yield target, which is the, if I got it well, an attainable yield, assuming the adoption of some sustainable practices. However, coffee yields actually do vary significantly both across and within countries. And for instance, as you can see from this right panel figure, in Uganda, yields show very wide variation across provinces in Uganda. And this means that the productivity distribution is somehow right skewed, whereby the mean is much larger than the median. So if the target yield is based on the national mean, as seems to be the case, at least to me, there are two issues. First, the target may be quite unrealistic, if not unfeasible, for the majority of producers. And second, using this target, I mean, would inflate the denominator in the pricing formula, which ultimately lowers also the reference price, the LIRP. And the final point also concerns the cost data that have been used in formula, and more generally to the data sources that are being used. And so why the LIRP is somehow not meant to change frequently over time, and also with market conditions, production costs for farmers do evolve over time. And in fact, as you can see, although the total cost might be, production cost might be quite stable over these 5 years' time, the composition on the individual cost items can shift considerably over a few years. And this, so ensuring that these figures, cost figures, are somehow regularly updated is crucial for maintaining the formula's relevance and also the accuracy. But of course, this requires some substantial resources like running surveys and conducting research papers and so on and so forth. And so what we are trying to do, at least in MAFAP over the past few years, we are increasingly engaging in digital supply chain initiatives, such as the SKS in System Rwanda, to capture real-time cost data and support more dynamic price setting mechanisms. And this also will provide more other variable insights, such as certificates for traceability, but also price premium. And just to conclude, so to me, in this talk, I have kind of highlighted three main key points that are at least important to me. The risks of minimum prices becoming effective ceilings if buyers are not actively involved in a discussion. The second is that the need for yield targets that are realistic and achievable for the majority of producers. And the third is the importance of continuously monitoring and updating production costs, ideally using alternative and more recent data sources. And I think that, yes, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Davide. Thank you very much, Davide. Also very efficient with the time. And actually, I was thinking that given that, yeah, the presentation of Carla and yours are related, and then like Christine is gonna talk about a different, not exactly different topic, but like something different. Probably you can go ahead now with some questions regarding reference price setting, and then we will give some time to Carla to react to the discussion that the discussion points that Davide mentioned. So I have like a question that for Carla, also clarification coming from Katia Covarrubias, who presented today. So she said, Carla, how do you identify sustainable production in a crop in line with fair trade regulations, and how the cost estimated is then based on what fair trade certified farmers spend. So if you can clarify that point. Over to you, Carla.
Yeah, and I think that question is also related to one of the points that Davide made about the heterogeneity of yields in a country. So indeed, and because of that sustainable yield level is so influential of the final price outcome, this is really a topic of a lot of discussion. And even if we have not concluded that discussion, I must say as well, because we also have internal debate around who are we targeting for this. So for instance, talking about heterogeneity, there is the average fair trade farmer versus the average farmer in general, and in those cases, and we see a relatively a better position for the average fair trade farmer who has more access to services, who is organized, he has better access to inputs, for instance. So there is a certain advantaged position for the average fair trade farmer versus if you look at any farmer in a country. So there already is a part of the debate that I'm not going to have a straight answer to right away. What we try to define is in the conditions of the country and with the available support and services that a farmer has access to, what is feasible. And then as a starting point, we're looking at what is the 75th percentile of farmers, what are they achieving in terms of yield levels. That is then okay, and then is that realistic for the remainder of farmers who are effectively adopting those practices. And there is again a discussion point, because do we expect all farmers to adopt these agricultural practices that allow them to improve their yields, or is that not realistic? So I think you touched on a point that we're still also looking into in more detail. Where should we position ourselves with the benchmarking? And of course, we have the best access to the reality of the fair trade farmers. So that has been up till now like our main target group. But we also receive that feedback from civil society organizations, for instance, who say, well, we think it's a really good tool, that's important, but then you should be establishing it based on the reality of any farmer, and that it is really applicable to the industry as a whole. So this is not a conclusive discussion and not a conclusive answer, but I think to respond to who was that on the chat?
Katia.
If you're looking at the majority of the prices that we have set, those are more likely to reflect the reality of the fair trade farmer and then the production methods of the fair trade farmer. Also, there is a big variety there's not one single typical fair trade farmer. So also there we have a large range on productivity levels. But we can say these are the recommended practices, and this is on average the cost of production that this farmer should have by implementing those practices. I hope that is sort of answering your question.
Thank you, Carla. We have another question, and this is related to the labor requirements assumptions. And it says so this question is also, actually the question before was by Katerina Krubingel, who is also another of the co-authors of yesterday's paper, but this one is actually from Katia, apologies on that. So what she's asking is like she's wondering whether like the labor requirement assumptions may need to vary for different production systems. For instance, like rain or irrigation or irrigated systems, to define whether like a single or multiple harvest context could be considered, no? And what would be the implications for the living income reference price? Over to you, Carla.
Yeah, no, for sure. And so that's why it all starts by defining what does a sustainable production model look like in the given context. And interestingly, the example of Rwanda, next week I'll be in Rwanda to do this this whole process for Rwandan coffee. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes out. I have not much information yet. But yeah, I'm curious to hear also your findings on that. But yeah, so we start by and we're working in the context of a roundtable focus group. So we're inviting a group of experts from the local, from the country. So we're inviting producers who have the technical knowledge. We are inviting other technical experts in the country. We're inviting government representatives. And jointly, we come together to agree on like, what does it look like for Rwanda coffee, for instance, to produce sustainably? And then what are the practices that we can expect farmers to implement? And once we have that listed, then we can see, okay, how many days go into doing those practices on a farm. And this is how we start to discover little by little what are the costs and what are the input costs, what is the labor need, to what extent can a household member take care of that, to what extent do we need to outsource the labor. So it's really very context specific that we're analyzing those labor requirements in order to arrive at the total labor need and then the viable farm size.
Thank you, Carla. I have a question in the Q&A that I'm gonna read. Well, actually two from Ian Prates. So first, he's asking like whether how it can be used or combined the living income reference price model when a living wage reference price is already in use or published. Like he's referring, like for instance, to the case in the banana value chain. And then, I will read, just give you the floor to answer this one, and then we can go to the next one. Thanks.
Yeah, good question. So yeah, for bananas, it is an additional challenge that we have these two types of labors or production setups. We're working both with hard labor plantations and smallholder production systems, and whereas we're the living wage reference price is based on a plantation worker. The living income reference price is for targeting smallholder production. And there is, what we want to avoid is that the production different types of producers starts competing amongst each other, and that we would the likelihood that the living income reference price for smallholders would be more expensive than a living wage reference price for more efficient plantations, which would then push smallholder farmers out of the market, and that of course is not the intention. So this is still something we are starting to estimate reference prices for smallholder banana farmers this year, and then see what the difference is with a living wage reference price, and then look at what we can, how we can work with that to avoid this kind of internal competition.
Thank you, Carla. And Well, now actually the question for there's another question from Ian Prates, but this is for Davide. So what he mentioned is like, well, he congratulates for the presentation and for the initiative, and he's asking whether like Davide can clarify it, whether the digital supply chain initiatives are limited to how data and costs of production or other dimensions are collected, or if they're also aimed to change the overall approach formula used to calculate the prices, no? Either beyond the data source or level of disaggregation or update on costs, etc. David, over to you. Davide, scusa.
Yes, thanks. No, thanks, Jan. These are essentially initiatives aimed at traceability solutions. So to increase transparency in the overall supply chain by recording all the transactions between the different actors involved in the supply chain. So farmers, in this case, wet mills, exporters, and ultimately buyers. Hoping to receive also, records from final consumers in the end. And related to this, we are also collecting within this mobile app system also costs for the different actors involved, thereby allowing us to continuously monitor and update the cost data that I was mentioning before, and also the minimum price setting formula used by NAEB to set this reference price. But this is not an isolated initiative, I would say. There are several out there, including in Costa Rica for coffee, but also in Ghana for cocoa. So there are, and that's why I was really encouraging fair trade to leverage this somehow initiative to get the data required to compute the LIRP in a more systematic and let's say realistic way. Thanks.
Thank you, Davide. We have like another question here in the Q&A. Well, I guess both of you can answer, and he's like, comes from Elian Mendez Vargas, and he's asking whether by implementing the living income reference price, could companies claim that their living income gap is zero? So, yeah, maybe Carla, Davide can
The
elaborate.
answer is no. I think I already explained that on one of the first slide what it is not. It's not a guarantee that that farmers effectively make a living income, and that is because, for instance, if the farmer does not meet the target yield and therefore produces less than is necessary to reach living income, even if paid at a living income reference price, that is already a reason for not earning a living income. Also, if the farmer has less land than the viable crop area to depend on that crop entirely, that would mean that they would make a proportional part of a living income to then the land size that they have dedicated to the crop. But then the household additional available labor still needs to also generate a proportionate share of the living income, and that is not a guarantee, and that you cannot guarantee that as a buyer of a certain crop either. So there are several factors that are not in control of a buyer that make it impossible to make that claim.
Thank you, Carla. We have another question, and well, related to what Katya asked before, and she's like by Ana Paula, and she's wondering like how to address technologies used and markets of a specific varieties of agricultural products in the computations of living income reference price. No? So to what extent reference prices could or should be very specific to the context, like not only on production prices but like more broadly, these prices would also affect the living income costs. So over to you.
I'm not sure if I understand the question well.
So she's asking like whether like how to address like the technologies that are used. So similar to the production practices, I guess, is linked to that like the assumptions that are taken on whether like it should be to what extent, you know, the computation of living income reference prices should be very specific to this context.
Yeah, so again, when we establish a living income reference price for a country, for a specific crop, and then it can be also for a specific production model like organic, conventional, or agroforestry, but still it will be an average. It will be based on a typical model for a country that is not necessarily applicable to any specific farmer. So how precise you want to have it, it depends also on the kind of claim that you want to make from it. Like if you're, what we would suggest is that the average LERP for a country would bring you to close enough to taking your responsibility as a buyer to pay the right price. But if your aim is to guarantee a living income for the farmer in your supply chain, then you would probably need to go more into detail. What is the specific reality of that farmer? Do they have lower yields? Do they have larger farms? Do they have more diversified incomes? And then do a specific supply chain level calculation. So it really depends also what you want to be able to claim in the end.
Okay, thank you. And well, before probably giving you like last floor for a few minutes, if you want to reply something to all the points that David mentioned, I wanted to ask like whether the colleagues that are here whether they have a question for Carla or for Davide before. No? Okay, so if you want to go ahead, like something that Davide mentioned that you would like to comment on, Carla, and then we can go to the presentation of Cristina.
And yeah, I think very briefly, I think the sustainable yield heterogeneity, we already discussed it. Regarding the changes of cost of production you mentioned, it will be changing over time, and that's also the reason why we need to review the reference prices regularly. We're now looking at what is a realistic or life cycle basically of a crop, and do of a LERP, and then review them every couple of years, or do inflation corrections intermediate. You also rightly say that that's time consuming and costly, so we also have to find a reasonable balance between keeping these prices up to date versus and that's keeping them up to date, but also we want to allow for certain stability in the market with buyers who commit to paying a LERP. Changing them every year, for instance, is also difficult if you want to make that commitment. You also, as a business, need to be able to plan your business ahead. So we try to also balance stability, price stability versus keeping them up to date as much as possible. And then you mentioned something about digital data collection, which I'm really interested in. So I'd like to hear more about your project, especially in Rwanda. That would be ideal, and there's lots of potential of better and more agile ways of working with data, but we haven't worked with that yet. So anything you can share about that would be very welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you both, like Carla and Davide, for the presentations. And now we will give the floor to Cristina for like the closing discussion section. And then we will have like a little short time also for some questions for her presentation. So the floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you, Esteban. Thank you to FAO for inviting me here today. I think following on from the very technical discussions that we've had yesterday and today, I'm going to close with kind of taking a step back and giving more of an overview of what's happening more globally in the living income space, some examples both from companies as well as governments and sector work on living income and how that links to some of the topics that were discussed yesterday and today. So thank you to Carla and Davide for being so efficient with your time, because I always have quite a lot to say on this topic, so I'm hoping I might get to squeeze an extra 5 minutes out, because there's a lot to say. So Stefan, if we could share the screen, sure, please. For those that don't know me, my name is Christina Archer. I work for a small organisation called the Sustainable Food Lab. We work directly with companies on living income and their living income strategies, but also we co-chair the Living Income Community of Practice together with GIZ and ISEAL. And under that hat, we were here in FAO about 18 months ago discussing living income and introducing it to FAO and exploring ways that FAO could be involved. I think we've gone through the whole presentation already, so it's a little...
It's going automatic, sorry.
Just to say also, I'm going to be bringing in some examples today from the coffee sector, so delighted to be able to continue from both Carla's presentation and Davide's, because Rwanda is one of the focus countries of the coffee sector to look at living income. If it's possible to go to the slide before...
Yeah,
there we go.
Sorry, it's in the slideshow, so...
Yeah, it's okay. So just as a recap, yesterday Katja did a great job at reminding us what is living income. And we heard in great detail how living income is calculated and that it's looking at and Carla again repeated it today, but is looking at a decent standard of living for smallholder farmers. And I just wanted to kind of again sort of remind us, why is it important, we would say, that FAO colleagues just maintain an interest in this area, because it is a subject and it is a framing that is being used across many different countries, many sector platforms, and many different types of organisations. So ranging from consuming governments such as Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands, who have issued joint declarations on promoting living income and living wages, through to producing governments such as the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, working with a living income differential, the international coffee organisations producing and consuming member states have all again signed commitments to understand and work on living income and closing the gap, as well as other sector platforms such as Swiss platform for cocoa, a lot of work happening on cocoa and coffee, but increasingly other sectors such as palm, vanilla, tea and so on. I am sitting opposite Victor, so I'm mindful that bananas is missing from this, but now that the banana sector is also working on living income, we're going to make sure we include that in the next platform. So it's a topic of great discussion amongst public and private sector. Next slide, please. It is linked to some of the legislation that's coming out as well. It's a recommendation in the EUDR, recommendation 50, that where possible, living incomes should be paid for smallholder farmers. And it is key to the continuing to evolving EU CSDDD. However, we're also hearing, and I think this is a discussion I've had with FAO colleagues today, it is also a topic of great interest to investors. And through the Dutch Sustainable Trading Initiative, for example, there's been a big group of investors committing to looking and supporting work that's happening on living wages and living incomes. Many of the companies that we work with are increasingly being asked by their investors what work they're doing on living incomes as well. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the consuming governments as well have indicated their support for working more closely on living income and living wages. Next slide, please. We know that quite a few governments are starting to use living income as a framework and an analysis that is contributing and informing a lot of the work they do. Obviously, governments are the main partner for FAO, so interested to know, I'm sure the colleagues will be interested to know that in many countries we are seeing that it is being a helpful input for governments, Ministry of Agriculture, Environment, Planning, Statistics, etc., to use this approach to examine which of our smallholder farmers have incomes towards this level of decency and what can be done to close those gaps. So it is beginning to help inform what are the risks that we have here, what are the investments needed. It's being used in some cases to inform the development of regional budgets, for example. But really, much more importantly, what we found is that it is the process of understanding a living income and a living income gap has been used and is being used increasingly as a collaborative process. So bringing the many stakeholders together that we've heard Carla talk about today, across government, across civil society, across private sector, to jointly understand what is the living income in this context for this particular commodity, for this crop, and what are the gaps and what roles do we all have to play in closing that gap. So we've heard about pricing, which is one, but we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other ones in the next few slides. Next slide, thank you. Living income's been used by the private sector quite extensively for quite a few years, and Carla's already mentioned that the LERP is something used quite a lot by companies, and a lot of the living income work that we've seen happening across the cocoa sector, coffee sector over the last few years has really been the focus of some of the big trading companies, for example. Why are they doing this? By speaking to companies themselves, what we're hearing very much is that for many of them, they are doing human rights, due diligence, assessments, either because legislation is now requiring it or because they see it as the right thing to do. And of course, as we heard earlier, paying a decent remuneration, be it for a farmer as well as workers, is part of the human rights salient issues that they're emerging with. So part of those strategies. Also, of course, part of reducing reputational risk. So how can companies be seen to, well, be seen, but they have to be seen, and they are continually investing in their smallholder farmers and making sure that that's, they are helping and being seen to contribute to that decent standard of living. And also, in many cases, it is a security of supply issue for the many reasons why smallholder farmers are not meeting a living income. That is all impacting on security of supply. And so there is a business case as well as a moral case for working on living income. And we are seeing many companies, for a mix of these reasons, working a lot more on private sector. Next slide, please. So just to kind of build on what we've heard in the last couple of days, and some of you who were part of the workshop that we did here a year and a half ago will remember this slide and the discussion that we had about when you have identified that there is an income gap for your smallholder farmers in a particular country, in a context, within a commodity, within a supply chain. There are many ways to close the gap. Price and trading practices, as we've heard today, is of course a really important one and really key levers. We also know there's been a lot of investment, and again we heard that today, and it's the foundational pillar of the LERP, as we heard, is improving production, productivity, yields, quality, etc. And that's where we have seen a lot of focus over the last few years at that sort of farm and value chain level. More needs to be done, especially on price and trading practices, but in many of the smallholder contexts we're working in, we know that there is still a huge way to go in terms of improving productivity in a sustainable way, but also finding ways of strengthening the value chain, strengthening producer organisations and so on. So depending on where you are, if it's Rwanda, if it's Indonesia, if it's Ethiopia, if it's cocoa, if it's coffee, if it's bananas, that will all impact on which of this mix of strategies you do need to deploy to make sure that gap is closed. However, there are additional levers that are maybe only beginning to be looked at, and this is where, as the Living Income Community of Practice, we really welcome, well, across all of them, but especially with these, we welcome FAO's input and engagement and involvement. But how do we go beyond looking just at farm level and at pricing to the other levers that also we know have impacts on the underlying developmental issues at community level that do impact on, for example, the cost of a benchmark or the ability of farming and producing households to be able to improve their incomes? How are we looking after natural resource management and protection? what other agricultural systems or productivity or options are there for improving incomes. And then, of course, that underlying sector and government policy, the enabling environment, which are really key to a sustained and sustainable income increase. So issues such as, availability of credit, access to land, obviously, but that sector dialogue that we know in many countries has been identified as a key lever for exchanging of practices, but also commonly identifying investments needed to close the gap. So just as a recap, there is no one way of reducing incomes. Price is really important, absolutely fundamental, as well as we need to look at some of the other levers that can be deployed as well. Next slide, please. And within a farming household, we know, again, there are many different pathways. So as we've heard repeatedly, it's very context specific. Even within a country like Rwanda, there's going to be different farmers who can improve their incomes through specialization. So still focusing on coffee, but able to access markets that will pay higher prices. But in other contexts, there won't be. So you need to look at beyond that. What else can those farming households realistically look at in terms of diversification of their incomes, improving incomes from existing crops they're growing, or introduction of new crops where possible? Where are the markets for that? How can they access them? And will they also be good alternatives for closing that income gap? And in some cases, we know there's going to have to be a transition to additional off-farm labour opportunities, working in service industries and so on. But there may be cases, and we know there are cases, where other sources of income beyond the farm also will play a role in closing that income gap. But it's absolutely fundamental, and something that we're always really trying to make sure is avoiding that race to the bottom, and also making sure that no farmer is left behind. So abandoning farmers that need to transition is never something that's recommended as part of the living income strategy. Next slide, please. And this slide here, lots of writing on it, might not be very clear if you're looking at it on a small screen, but we will share the slides later. This comes from the private sector toolkit that the Living Income Community of Practice has developed guidance for at the private sector, where again it's just kind of giving illustrations of, once you know or you're getting visibility into what the different types of income sources are of smallholder farmers. We know they are not always reliant on the one crop. There are many different sources. For each of those, what kind of levers can you pull to start closing that gap? So looking at levers such as safety nets, where we know they're reliant on non-farm-based income. Are there economic or asset development levers that can help develop some of that off-farm income that we were discussing? The main crop that is being looked at, as I've mentioned earlier, price, productivity, etc., are the common levers, and equally for some of the other crops that are looked at. So those are kind of the ways that you can increase them, and then for each of those you'd have lots of different strategies depending again on the context, ranging from how to professionalise producer organisations, improve land tenure, etc., and then suggestions about how that could be done. Not all of it can be done by the private sector alone, nor should it be. So there are action pathways, as they're called, where it encourages that public-private partnership. How do you collaborate at a sector level to try and address some of those levers that need to be deployed and develop some of those strategies? Where does it make more sense for a company to invest in its supply chain because they have more control or are able to bring about closing the gap through deploying that lever? So again, just to illustrate many ways of closing the gap depending on who you are, and this one here was particularly focused for the private sector. Next slide, please. Just to start bringing a couple of examples in of how living income is being used. For the cocoa sector, Nestlé, a company known to all, as part of its cocoa plan for many years has been working to understand the levels of poverty within the cocoa supply chain that it has, It does have a living income action plan at a corporate level and has identified living income as one of its 10 salient human rights issues. Having invested in many different types of levers, they wanted to, and they trialled in 2022, a pilot in Côte d'Ivoire to look at the income accelerator, as they're called, which went very well. And then they went to testing it at scale the following year, covering 10,000 families. Again, met all expectations, and now they're rolling it out to all of their supply chains in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. And the model is also being used now for coffee as well. They are doing this in partnership with Rainforest, the Dutch Trading Initiative, KIT, and so on. And I'll go to the next slide to just talk a little bit more about it. A lot of information on their website about this if you'd like to look at it in more detail. But effectively, the income accelerator is tackling the child labour issue, which has been around for some time in cocoa, as we know, through looking to materially decrease the poverty levels there, promoting income diversification and also supporting gender equality. Doing that through actual cash transfers, so it's a tool that's being deployed in the development space for quite a while. Now we're seeing companies trying to see how it could be brought into some of their programs here as well. So there are 4 conditions that have to be met. If they are met, there are monetary, as I said, cash transfers, which can be up to 500 euros a year. This is transferred electronically with half of the funds going to the husband and half to the wife. The conditions being that your children are enrolled in school, you are implementing the specified good agricultural practices which are going to be leading crop productivity, implementing agroforestry, and also looking where relevant at other diversified incomes as well. I do have to say, and our kind of experience with this is you can't just, this has not been a standalone program that was just developed and implemented and dropped in, but it has built on and does rely on this really solid foundation which has been built over a long-term relationships. So going back to a point that Carla has made before, of farm coaching services. So there has been that trust between partners and farmers that has been on which they've been able to now introduce this program and achieve the results that they have. So that was just a quick company example. If there are any questions on this, I can do my best to try and answer. But as I said, there's a lot of information. There's impact assessment reports, etc., on the website and from the various partners as well. So please do look at that. Next slide, please. But what we're hearing from companies especially is I can do my bit. Companies can always do more. I appreciate that. But you're going to reach a stage by which no matter how much companies are investing in, that scale up really can only happen in working closer with governments. And so increasingly, we're looking at how do we build on kind of these islands of excellence, if we like, at farm level, potentially landscape level, but how do we also bring living income into some of these discussions happening at subnational and national level, moving on to global, with some of those enabling environment factors that I mentioned in my slide about the different strategies to close the gap. And we've heard many companies kind of say, we need to be collaborating more with governments, with civil society, because there are actions that need to be taken by all actors. Next slide, please. So a very, very quick example. Again, we shared this at the workshop before, but as an example of where public and private are working together across a whole sector is the coffee sector. So the International Coffee Organization has representation of 44 producer countries and about 23 consuming countries, as well as many other supporting organizations there, including the private sector. And back in 2020, they developed a vision for the coffee sector that included economic resilience and social sustainability, which is being tackled through looking at living and prosperous income, and that's the group that we are facilitating. So the coffee sector has made commitments about understanding living income and working together to close the gap in producing countries. Next slide, please. Again, lots of information on this on the ICO website, but as a snapshot, The different colours relate to where there are benchmarks and reference values. Again, we have been using the anchor benchmarks until now, so you'll see nearly all of the countries are covered. And there are very active living income initiatives between public and private sector happening for the coffee sector in Mexico, Honduras, Peru, Rwanda, a long list there you can see across Asia, Africa, Central and South America. So lots of examples of where this is happening. Next slide. And just to finish off with a country example, so where a government has been using the living income framework and analysis to progress its work in coffee. So the Mexican government, the Ministry of Agriculture, in order to, building on the commitments made with the ICO back in 2023, launched its living income process at a national level. And just to go back to the discussion that we had yesterday, they very much saw, as many people do, the living income benchmark process not as being a standalone study, but using the opportunity of convening to determine the various components of the benchmark, to validate the benchmark, was a way then of getting the sector together, of having ownership of what that benchmark is by producer groups, by private sector, by government. So when we come to the end and they identified what the living income, an indicative living income gap is, everybody knows where that's come from and everybody is already on board. So there's very wide consultation across all of their coffee producing regions with producer groups to introduce the concept of living income, of decency, of economic resilience, and why the study that was going to be done was going to give that target that the coffee sector would be using to determine its coffee strategy. That nationwide consultation, to do it well, did take over a year because they wanted to ensure that ownership by all of the actors and the stakeholders. And at the same time, they also did a parallel process to the one that Davide mentioned in his presentation in Rwanda. They did the same in Mexico as well. And that was used to identify the income gaps. Interestingly then, the government has used that framing to find, as I said, the illustrative, what is the gap, but as a way to model through what are our interventions, what are the existing Ministry of Agriculture programs and interventions that we have in place for the coming years, how will they close the gap, and what else is needed, because there still will be a gap after that. So what else can the private sector do? Research organisations, donors, supporters. So this is going to be built on this year to develop a much more detailed living income roadmap for the public-private interventions. Already they know 3 broad areas will be increasing domestic consumption of coffee and quality coffee at that. How do we sustainably increase productivity and reduce costs in order to increase incomes to, but hopefully beyond, living income. So there's just some examples there of how living income is being used across companies and countries and sector level. And I think that's my last slide. My last slide. So just with that to say, the living income community of practice, I'll put the link in the chat later, is free and open to all. So lots of the topics that you all brought up are themes of discussion there as well. So please do join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christina, for the presentation. And we have around 10 minutes for questions. But before going to those that are in the chat, I wanted to ask whether there are some questions from the people that's here to Christina that you'd like to answer. No? Okay, so we have 2 questions. Sorry.
Well, you can go first.
Sorry, Victor, I didn't.
No, please go ahead with the question.
Okay. Sorry. So, Katerina Krumingel asked, she said, as you said, the living income focus has been utilized a lot by the private sector. So as you have pointed out, the heterogeneity of farmer means that they require different strategies, no? So, but at the end of the day, what is the interest of the private sector to encourage farmer to produce less of crop they want to buy? So if you can comment on that.
Many of the companies that we work with, obviously it is not in their interest to produce less of what they want. I think the coffee sector is interesting because there it is an explicit aim of the coffee sector to maintain the diversity of origins. So we don't only want to buy very cheap mass-produced coffee from some of the bigger producers, but we do need our whole industry is based on having that diversity of profiles. So we need to try and make sure that coffee farmers who want to and can still produce coffee are able to do so. But how do we kind of improve their ability to also, where it makes sense, grow other crops or find other sources of income? And that's where partnerships come in. So if they are already growing another crop, I'm not a coffee buyer, but they're growing pepper, for example, then who else can buy that at a good price? How do we form partnerships to try and improve their income sources from other crops? Not necessarily as a company wanting them to shift away from what I'm producing.
Okay, thank you. We have like a next question that's from Katia Covarrubias, and she's asking like, do you know, well, probably, yeah, because you mentioned that your knowledge is limited with the Lincoln accelerator, sorry, but like, she's asking whether do you know if there are monitoring systems or data collection tools are being used by Nestle to ensure the compliance with the conditions under the income accelerator program.
Yes, I know, I believe there are, and apologies, I'm not very familiar with it, but I do believe they're working in partnership with organisations such as the Dutch Tropical Institute, Rainforest and others in order to have the monitoring systems for the various variables there.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Then, well, Davide actually is asking, and he's asking both to Christina and Carla. So he's saying, given the phase of the structural transformation process, if our goal is to ensure that people earn the net income necessary to afford a decent standard of living in a specific location, should we subsidize the job? For instance, like a coffee farmer, conditional continuing to work in the farm, or the individual? Which approach would be more effective?
I think one of the approaches to this is always farming should be a profitable and decent job for those that want to continue doing that. So you also don't want to be tying somebody to be a farmer, because many of the young people now actually for various reasons may not want to be farming. So what other opportunities exist for them is part of those kind of more longer term structural discussions on the food systems in that country and where they're going to. So it's definitely not about tying farmers to the particular profession they're doing now, but giving them the option of it is a decent livelihood that you have for those that want to continue doing that, which we hope they do. But Carla, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, no, I was thinking very similar to what you're saying. And at first, I don't think any of us should be deciding for a person and what they want to do for their livelihood, but any choice that each individual would make should allow them to be able to support a decent livelihood, as long as they can be like fully dedicated to that job. And then the other factors come into play. So if you are you only have a very tiny plot of land, that would not allow you to be fully dedicating your available time to it. So then, yeah, the proportion of the income that you can make from your land would be, yeah, proportional to the time that you're actually spending. And then you still need to have additional income sources to complement that income. But yeah, again, if that farmer, however small the land is, wants to use that land to make that proportional share of a living income, then who are we to say that you're not, you're not supposed to do that, because that's not viable. But yeah, I think that that's part of a larger reflection that can be made.
Thank you, Christina and Carla, and well, Victor, would you like to?
Thank you very much to all of you. It was insightful. I was wondering, in occasions, you know, that we face issues because if we conduct studies for the same commodity in different countries, that can create some discrepancies. We can even have an impact on trade, you know, because a retailer could prefer to purchase that commodity in the other country that maybe offers more sustainability as they offer, because it's difficult to track that down in occasions. And of course we have a role to play there. And how do you think we can work on a platform that could be inclusive and can include several governments, and how we can work together to have like a massive movement on living income versus the standalone activities in a country for a commodity?
It's a great question, and Carla, I hope you can also jump in because you work across multiple commodities. But I think this is a discussion that we've been starting to have in many countries, as I mentioned earlier, are interested and are working on living income in different ways. For example, the government of Indonesia, through its Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Trade, have indicated and are supporting living income work in the coffee sector, cocoa sector and palm sector. But at the moment, we're coming at it through different sector organisations or through different private sector initiatives and so on. And that harmonisation in country, as Victor says, is something that we do see as a need. So how could an organisation, for example, such as FAO or others, convene in country to try and harmonise? David, it's a point you made earlier about harmonising of data, but harmonising, looking at what does decency mean here for smallholder farmers. What does, the enabling environment for closing the gap, be you a palm smallholder farmer or banana or coffee, might be quite similar. So trying to bring some of those together, I think, is definitely sorely needed. I think living income as a movement, as I sort of mentioned, started with ad hoc private sector initiatives, but as I showed in some of the first slides, it's definitely growing into a much bigger movement. And so that harmonisation is still something that we're working on. It's would be great to see more of that happen.
Thank you.
And maybe to add to that, part of that, like the bigger picture is also a challenging element to it, because if we're looking at it at different price levels or different gaps, the gap will be larger in one country versus another country, and how to then avoid hit and run practices that companies just shift their sourcing to the origin where the smallest gap is or where the lowest reference price would be applicable. I think that is more a matter for policy to tackle, to make sure that there is a responsibility to continue sourcing from the farmers who need it most. But yeah, again, that is part of a very challenging political discussion to be had. But I think organizations like FAO can play a role there.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Carla, Cristina, and Davide for today's presentation. We are like almost in time to finish. I just wanted to thank everyone, like also the presenters of yesterday, Katia, Richard, and Martha, Anker, Beyene, and Victor that is here today. I think we have had like a very lively discussions across these 2 days, and I think we have probably I have learned a lot from you from hearing these presentations, and I think also the people that is here, we thank you very much, and we hope to see you all in the next event that we will organize, probably around May and June, which is going to be related with, well, not necessarily living income, but actually tax incentives for healthy diet consumption. So I encourage you to keep checking the web page or our team channel here within FAO, and without further, thank you very much and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you too. Bye bye.
Thank you.